Welcome back, everybody, to KK Chat with Paula and Nat. Today is episode 2 in our Pressure Point series with Tracy Nowicki. Now, we're going to be talking today about pressure injuries, or Tracy's going to take us through how to stage the pressure injuries. But before we get into that, Nat, we've had some fantastic responses to the first episode that we did on Pressure Point series, haven't we?
Yeah, we've received some wonderful feedback. We've got aged care groups using it as part of their education sessions, the clinical educators, and a heap of OTs, new and established, using it as part of as a resource as well. The comments were the information was simple and easy to understand. So the messages, those takeaways that you gave us like in our first session, Tracy, like the shear and pressure are the causes of pressure injuries, mucosal pressure injuries always has a medical device, and really stressing the importance of identifying the cause of a PI before we start staging. So yeah, we're off to our next part of it. So can't wait to hear how to stage. Tracy, so welcome back.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be back, and I want to thank KCare for making this possible. And it's very exciting because for a long time, education was sort of on hold with COVID, and you guys have really brought it back and made it really simple and also fun. So well done to everyone that tunes in, and it's lovely to be able to share this information with you. So it's fantastic. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, and I don't mind if I use a bit of Alzheimer teaching, which is repeating myself. So I just want to make sure that we reinforce a couple of important points. And the first thing is understanding the definition of a pressure injury. And the word I want you to remember when I talk about the definition of a pressure injury is it's a localized area of damage to the skin, usually caused by pressure or a combination of pressure and shear. It can be over a bony prominence, but now they've actually added a bit which talks about related to a device or other object. So the reason I say other object is there's medical device pressure injuries and device pressure injuries. So that's another talk if we get time to do that. So the word I'm going to give you, when I'm trying to teach, I'm trying to not talk too much, but give you a couple of one words to remember when you're trying to think, now, what did she say there? The one word when you're talking about a definition of a pressure injury is to remember the word localized. And the reason for that is when we're trying to, if you look back in, I mean, I'm an old girl now, so I've watched pressure injuries for about 40 years. And if we look back, and it wasn't that long ago where everything that was red was called a pressure injury. And a lot of wounds were called pressure injuries. Everything was called a pressure injury. And people are a lot more interested in getting it right now. And sometimes it's because we're getting a lot of penalties from pressure injuries. And we need to know, is it actually a pressure injury or is it something else? And there's lots of things that can look like a pressure injury. So when I talk about pressure injury, I think the number one lesson to look at is what's causing this injury. And there are lots of causes that can cause injury to skin and underlying structures. So we've got epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous, muscle, bone, tendon. So we've got lots of layers. When we're talking about pressure injuries and how to stage them, we talk about layers. But there are other injuries to the skin that cause other things. So for example, skin tears. They often get put down as a pressure injury, but when you talk about a skin tear, you've got to remember it's a traumatic incident. It's usually when you fall or you hit your arm. They're usually on the lower parts of the limb, so from the knees down and the elbows down, and you bang into something and it tears the epidermis and dermis. Now, skin tears is a talk for another day, because remember, I've only got 20 minutes today, but we need to remember that a skin tear is not a pressure injury. Now, there's a few other things that get confused with pressure injuries, and the one that's really, really confusing is diabetic foot ulcers. And I've seen many arguments from even high-end professionals, wound consultants, podiatry, where is it a pressure injury? Because they look and see this injury on a heel or a foot, because you can get when your foot's at the end of the bed and everybody's got great grandma's quilt and Auntie Jane's blanket and all these things, all this weight on the tops of their toes, they can end up with these terrible pressure injuries on the tops of their toes. So that's what we talk about, the cause of being pressure. But really, sometimes it's actually, it might not be the cause of pressure. It could be just that they've got a diabetic foot ulcer. So we really need to understand. So we've got to look at the cause. Now, the other really big one that sometimes gets called a pressure injury is leg ulcers. And this is venous and arterial insufficiency. And you see the leg starting to break down, and people start calling them a pressure injury. Well, you know, that's the other word. You know, when I talk about the definition, the word that I want to sing out loud and clear to you is the word injury, a pressure injury. So people that are still using the term ulcer, that is outdated. The only people in the world that are using ulcer now is some of the Europeans are using it because that's part of their language. Injury isn't. But if we look at what we used to call them, bed sores, that's a big no-no, because you don't just get a pressure injury when you're lying down. In fact, you're at higher risk when you're sitting up. So bed sore is out. And the word pressure ulcer is out, because when we get finally around to talking about what a stage 1 looks like, it's still intact skin. So there's no wound there as such. It's a persistent redness. So that's why we don't like to call it an ulcer. It's a pressure injury. Now, this caused a lot of spark through the world because the Americans we started it in the Pan Pacific, which is Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, and Hong Kong. Did I say Hong Kong? We all started that in about 2009, and then the Americans sort of came on board in about 2016, and they were hesitant because the word injury in the Oxford Dictionary means a wrongful action or harm to the body. Now, they have a country that has billboards that says, did you get a pressure ulcer? We'll get you money. There's a lot of litigation around it. In our country, in Australia, the government is now penalising for facility-acquired pressure injuries. So we need to make sure that we understand, is it actually a pressure injury? And to understand that, we need to look at the cause. So the cause of a pressure injury is not like a trauma, like a skin tear. It's not like a diabetic foot ulcer from chronic diabetes. It's not a leg ulcer from venous insufficiency or arterial insufficiency. And then there's the other one that I haven't gotten to talking about yet, which is MASIs and MARIs, which is a new term. So the MASI being moisture-associated skin damage, injury. And then that's from, there's 4 different types of moisture injuries. So we're looking at IAD, incontinence-associated dermatitis. So that's urine and feces is the cause. So remember I said keep going back to the cause. Intrateginous dermatitis, which is 2 skin folds coming together, trapped with friction and moisture, and that causes a really raw red rash. So that is the cause is friction and moisture. Then there's I've said MASIs, then there's MARIs, which is medical adhesive related skin injury. So you're pulling off tape and rip comes the skin. That is not a pressure injury. There's probably a couple more in there, but I've started off kind of the backward way of doing things before we get into how to stage a pressure injury, which is we're going to talk about what we're not going to talk about. So we're not going to talk about skin tears. We're not going to talk about IAD. We're not going to talk about moisture lesions. But I think the message I'm trying to get to you loud and clear is understand what's causing it, because we misdiagnose, we call everything a pressure injury. But if we look at this, is actually caused from urine and feces, and it's overhydrated the skin and raw, it's eaten away at the skin and causes big, red rash like the size of a continence pad. That is not a pressure injury. But number 2 message is these can cohabitate together. So you can have incontinence-associated dermatitis and a pressure injury. In fact, when the skin is damaged from the incontinence-associated dermatitis and you add pressure and shear in there, there can be a pressure injury living there as well. So this is a little bit complicated, and hopefully I'm giving you a couple of one words to try and remind you. So going back, the definition of a pressure injury.
Localized.
Localized.
Yeah, you beat me. That's fantastic. So it's localized. When we look at the cause of a pressure injury, there's 2 main causes.
Pressure and shear.
Pressure.
That's it. I love the K-Care team. They're so clever. Okay, so that's where I want to look at that whole. And the other thing that we always think pressure injury is caused from pressure, but the reality is now there's been massive amounts of study done, particularly in Europe. Geffens is the professor of Geffens' name, where he actually found out it was shear that's causing most of the injury. And what I want to take you to, and which is what we talked about on our first webinar, is that one cell. So the one cell is getting crushed, broken, bent, and distorted, and the forces of gravity are pushing the skeleton down the bed, and that cell is getting broken and torn. And that's why we need to understand this is a lot more than just finding it. It's about preventing it by positioning them. It's what you lie them on, how you position them are really important. But I think that's a webinar for another day, because I keep getting distracted and I need to talk to you about how to stay.
Yes.
There's so
Excellent.
much. There's so much knowledge there that we need to get out of you.
Yes.
Oh, well, this is fun, and it's a great opportunity. It's fantastic that K-Cares provide the opportunity for people to grab 20 minutes to learn about such an important topic. So we talked about the definition, we've talked about the causes. Now we need to go into how do you stage them. Now, there's a bit of a trick question. If I had an interactive audience at the moment, I'd probably talk to you about, tell me how many stages there are. And I know I've got two clever little girls here. Yes, there we go. Paula's straight on to it. 4 stages. Now, it's very interesting when you get a live audience there. There's some people will say 4, some people will say 5, some people will say 6, and some people will say 7. And now the ones that say 4, I say you're right, but there's a bit of a trick to this question, because I could have said, how many categories do you have? So there's a difference between a stage and a category. Now, if we break this down further, I think Paula's biting at the bit to tell us, not only is there 4 stages, what else goes along with it?
There's a few more categories that go with it. You've got 1, 2, 3
That's
categories.
Good
On
work.
to the
Good
end.
work. So if we look, just to try and get a summary going before we actually start, we have the 4 stages. But along with all the revisions that the Europeans and the Americans and the Pan-Pacific have done, is that they've created 2 temporary categories. And then on top of that, there's one that sits on its own, which is a mucosal. So what I want you to write down while you're taking notes on this is 4 plus 2 plus 1. And that's what I'm going to go into with the definition. Now, the reason that I was excited when K-Care asked me to talk about staging, the reason this is so important, because they could have told me to talk about equipment and told me to try and make sure that I sell all their equipment. And they've never asked me to do that, because this is an honest thing. All they want to do is try and support you guys with education. And we will get onto equipment, because you can't prevent pressure injuries without the right equipment. But what I want you to understand is, despite doing 20 and 30 years of education on pressure injuries, about 30% of the world still can't stage pressure injuries correctly. And that's why I started off by saying we're calling everything that's red a pressure injury, or everything that's a skin break a pressure injury, when it is not. So that's why the second webinar is all on just how to stage a pressure injury. So let's get onto those 4 stages to start off with. And we go for the stage 1. I'm going to give you one word there, which is intact. So you need to remember, when you're trying to work out, is it a 1 or a 2? The epidermis hasn't broken yet. Now, the way you tell is that we talk about this reactive hyperemia. That's actually what all you healthy backsides have got. And so while you're sitting there listening to this, you're getting a red bottom. And when you stand up, you go, oh, thank goodness she shut up. And in comes all the blood to the bottom. And it goes, we need to get some food in, some oxygen in, and some waste out. And you get this little red mark, and it goes away. Now, there used to be a time span on this. You used to say you've got 30 minutes to get rid of it. They've taken the time span out. And what they're asking us now to do is press on there and see if it blanches. Now, if it blanches, it is not a stage 1. It's reactive hyperemia. Reactive means it's reacting to offloading that pressure. Hyper means excessive, and emia is blood. So that's a normal body response. Every healthy person does it. You stand up, go, oh, thank goodness she's be quiet. I need to go and cook dinner for the kids. And boom, on comes all this blood to feed that area. So that is not a pressure injury. It's a normal body response to pressure. But then when you've got that persistent reddened area that does not blanch, that means the blood circulation is not working. So you get your thumb and you press on it. If it does not blanch, the skin is intact. That's the one word I want you to remember for a stage 1. That is a stage 1. Okay, now that actually is quite reversible. You can actually reverse that in about 24 hours if you offload that pressure that's causing it or the shearing that's causing it. But I'm not saying that all pressure injuries are reversible. I want you to hold that thought because we're going to go into that later. Now, one of the things that I want to talk to you about, because we're looking at the big picture here, is know what's normal for your patient, resident, client. And I've made the mistake of going in and reviewing someone that had really red heels. And I said, this patient's got bilateral stage 1 pressure injuries. When I talked to the patient, they said, my whole family's got this. We've got some sort of syndrome. We've all got red heels. It was not a pressure injury. So the next comment that I want you to write down is understand what's normal for your patient. I'm not saying that reddened areas are all not pressure injuries. All I'm saying is understand what's causing it. Now, the next point that's super, super important, and this is all the new stuff, if you look at the new guidelines that were developed in 2019, it's the first time we saw darkly pigmented skin introduced into the graphics.
Right.
So all up until then, all the diagrams were all Caucasian. Now, the reason that the whole world is very interested in staging on darkly pigmented skin is you can't always see that persistent redness. And we miss it. And what happens is we only see it when it's a stage 2, when the skin is broken. So I did a poster called Colour Matters. Pretty timely with the referendum coming up, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Anyway, persistent redness is difficult to see on darkly pigmented skin, and you need to be aware of that. So that means if you get a darkly pigmented person, look extra careful. And with skin inspection, it's not just looking, it's look, listen, and feel. So that's the really important bit. It's not just what you can see. So if you look at the definition in the guidelines, they talk about a stage 1 is intact. It's non-blanchable, and darkly pigmented skin may not have visible blanching. The other thing with a stage 1 that makes it a little bit confusing, because the stage 1's our easy one, is sometimes it's firm, sometimes it's boggy, sometimes it's hot, and sometimes it's cold. Now, I found this really interesting, and even more interesting when I found out why. So if you look at the initial body response to pressure, and the tissue starts to die, which is what's happening with the stage 1, you get a localized rigor mortis. Now, I think that's when stage 1 starts to sound very interesting. There's a localized rigor mortis, and the skin becomes very hard and hot. 24 hours later, the enzymes are underneath breaking down all that dead tissue, and it becomes boggy and cold because it's dead. And now that's why I want you to understand how important stage 1s are, because around about 80 or 90% of your residents, patients, and clients will have stage 1s. So don't just think it's just a little bit of a red mark. I'm not worried about it. It's really important. And so when you're doing a skin inspection, it's not just about looking, it's look, listen, and feel. What are you listening to when the patient says, oh, my heels are itchy, gee, my bottom's sore? They're alert for you. Okay, let's get on to stage 2. Now, stage 2, there's a little bit of a partial thickness loss of the epidermis and dermis. Now, the one word I want you to write down is it's shallow. Okay, it's not deep. It's only epidermis and dermis. Now, the next number 1 rule is there is no slough. So if you've got a shallow one, but it's got slough, it automatically becomes a 3. And just so I don't distract you, not all 3s have slough.
Wow.
And I also, yes, so if it's got slough, it automatically becomes a 3, but not all 3s have got slough. Now, there's one bit I really want you to concentrate on is some stage 2 can present as a blister. Now, when we talk about that blister, the one thing I want you to remember is it's serum-filled blister. I'm going to tell you why that's important a few more stages later. So stage 2, shallow. If it's a blister, it's serum-filled. There is no slough. And the other part of the definition is they talk about what a stage 2 is not. It is not a skin tear. It is not a tape burn. It is not perineal dermatitis. And if you remember what we talked about, that's how we started. What a pressure injury is not, right?
Yeah.
So the international guidelines have gone into that. Now, stage 3, it's getting serious. We've gone into full thickness. So we've got epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous are affected. It is not down to muscle, bone, tendon. Slough may be present. And you can't say it's a 3 because it's deep, because depending on the anatomical location is whether it will be deep or shallow. So, for example, if you get a pressure injury from your BiPAP, it's never going to be deep there because it doesn't take long to get past that epidermis, dermis, and there's not a lot of subcutaneous and muscle here. The same with the heel. The heel is a triangular bone and there's not a lot of protection. Unlike our backsides, where we've got plenty of padding, lots of muscle, and unfortunately some where we've got a bit too much subcutaneous there, they get deep. Okay, so that's why we need to understand that a stage 3 and a stage 4, they're not always defined as a 3 or 4 because they're deep. But you need to remember the amount of levels that are affected. It's epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous. Now we're on to stage 4. Stage 4 is also full thickness, but where it gets risky is it's down to muscle, bone, and tendon. Now, when we talked about slough, did we say stage 2s can have slough?
No, automatically stage 3, but not always have to be there. Slough.
Good work.
On stage 3.
Okay, so with a stage 4, this is what's changed from our decades of research. It may have a little bit of slough or Escher. If there's a lot, in the old days, if you had this big cavity that was just full of slough and Escher, we used to call it a 4. But we can't do that now, and I'll explain that to you with the temporary categories. I'm going to keep you on a bait there, on a bit of a hook. So just remember that if it's all slough and Escher, you can't call it a stage 4, but you can have a little bit. Now, a stage 4 traditionally tends to be quite deep, but what I'm trying to say to you is if you got a pressure injury on the ankle, so something like a patient who's always lying on one side, the ankle there's not much adipose or muscle there. It gets straight down to bone very quickly, and you've got a nasty stage 4. Okay, that's the 4 stages. I think we've covered that quite well. I've given you one word to remember each one of them. Now we're going to go into the 2 temporary categories. Now, the reason these are temporary categories is these will change and progress and eventually go into the 4 stages. So the first one I want to talk about is the suspected deep tissue. Now, there's a big debate with the Americans. They don't like the word suspected. They want to call it deep tissue injury. That has not had international consensus. So at this stage, we're still calling it a suspected deep tissue. Now, what I want you to concentrate on here is a suspected deep tissue can sometimes look like a stage 1. It can be intact, but is deep and dangerous. This is like the emerging monster. And the way you tell it is by its color. It's purple or maroon. So it's not that persistent redness. And it also can be very painful, firm, mushy, boggy, hot and cold. And it's another one that is really hard to detect in darkly pigmented people. Now, what happens is no matter what you do, whatever you feed them, whatever dressing you put on, whatever you lie them on, these things progress. They're like a volcano trying to erupt. So you're looking at this bit on the top, but underneath there's a whole lot of deep damage, and it eventually erupts, and so you'll end up with either a stage 3 or 4. So in the older, so it can get confused as a stage 1, but it's not. It's purple or maroon. That's what I want you to remember with the suspected deep tissue. Now, what also I want you to remember is if we go back to the stage 2, when I said it could be a blister, what sort of blister was it?
A serum field.
That's it, serum field blister. Now, the reason I wanted you to hold that is with a suspected deep tissue, I said it's intact. It can be a blister, but it's not a serum filled. What sort of blister do you think it might be?
Blood blister.
Blood.
That's it. I knew you two would know. Absolute champions. Okay, so if you see a blood-filled blister, it is not a stage 2. It is a suspected deep tissue. And the word I want you to remember with these is that it will evolve. That blood blister will burst. that intact purple skin will burst, and underneath is deep tissue damage, and it probably more likely go into a 3 or a 4. Now we're on to the unstageable pressure injury. Now, if you remember, I said in the old days we used to get these big cavities that were all covered in slough and escher, and we used to call them a 4. You can't call them a stage 4 anymore because we now have a temporary category called unstageable. And what that means is the reason we can't stage it is we can't see how deep it is because it's covered in slough and escher. So slough is usually grey, cream, green. It's soft and mushy, and then escher is like leather, and it can be brown, grey, green. And so it's either like this black, hard, leathery wound, or it's this sloughy, soggy, mushy slough. Okay, so we got lots of colours going: yellow, tan, green, brown. And so because they're on top of the wound, we can't see how many layers are affected. And you see all the way through, when I talked about 1, 2, 3, and 4, I talked about epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous, muscle, bone, tendon. And when we were trying to work out is it a 3 or 4, it wasn't how big or deep it was how many layers were affected. So if you see muscle, bone, tendon, it automatically becomes a
4.
That's it. Good work. Okay. And if we can't see those things, we have to temporarily call it an unstageable until that slough and escher comes off. Now, on the heel, traditionally, podiatry tend to say, leave it on. Don't take it off because it's a biological dressing that's protecting the foot. On the body, most of the wound consultants say, get it off. Start debriding, either chemically or mechanically, and we'll start getting this off so the wound can heal. So that's a different talk for another day on how to treat the wound side of these things. So unstageable, you can't see the level. It's covered in slough or escher. Now, that's the 2 temporaries. They move. Once the slough and escher comes off, you can either call it 3 or a 4.
3 or 4.
And sometimes with the heel, if that biological dressing stays on, it might not even present till it's a 2. It looks like a 2. But it was probably never a 2 because it was unstageable. We couldn't stage it. Now, the last one, we said there's 4 stages, 2 temporary categories. The last one is mucosal. Now, it's really important we understand the mucosal pressure injury, and it sits on its own because mucosal cavities, so cavities within the body, so we're looking at in the mouth, inside the nose, a stoma, when someone's got a stoma, rectal tubes inside the anus, vagina, endopenis, so all that wet, moist cavities inside there. If there's a medical device touching in those moist cavities, they can cause a mucosal pressure injury. Now, mucosal lining doesn't have an epidermis. There's usually not bone, and it's very difficult to compare the anatomical comparison. So you don't remember I kept saying with one of the stages, we tell what stage it is by the epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous, muscle, bone, tendon. These mucosal cavities that I just talked about don't usually have bone. They don't have epidermis and dermis. And the really, really, really scary bit is when mucosal lining's trying to heal, it gets this white coagular on it, and that looks like slough.
Okay.
And the worst thing you can do is think it's slough and start cutting it out, because it's. And I'm going to give you an example that you'll all think about. If you had a mouth ulcer, and they're usually white, how would you feel if I said, let me get my scissors and cut that white stuff off? Because that would be the worst thing I did for you, because it would actually increase the wound when it's really the healthy part of your mouth trying to heal by this thing called coagula. So that's why it's really, really, really important that we understand the mucosal category sits on its own. It doesn't behave the same. And this is the number 1 rule, because I've given you a lot of number 1s here, so I think your notepad is probably pretty full. A mucosal pressure injury must always be device related. Okay, so give me some examples. We talked about all those moist areas in the mucosal lining. Give me some examples of some devices you may see involving these structures.
Nasal prongs.
Good work. Yep. And we
Nasal
have to be
prongs,
careful
Catheter.
with nasal prongs. It's not the nose, it's inside the nose.
inside the
Yep.
nasogastric tube,
Catheters.
endotracheal tube,
Fantastic. Yep.
IDCs.
That's the one I'm passionate about. Okay. The
Yeah.
end of the pen is getting eroded by the IDC. Good work.
What else? You could have a stoma attached to a bag. So you've got,
Fantastic.
yep. Your turn, Nat.
I was saying it, but then you spoke over the top of me. I've got nothing left. So
No, that's all fantastic.
unless
So
Tracy said it, I've got no idea.
Yeah, no, you're amazing. So what I want you to remember is that mucosal pressure injuries must always be device related. The mucosal pressure injury does not behave like the skin, and that's why it sits on its own. So remember, we talked about 4 stages. How many temporary categories?
Two.
Three. Two.
How many
Deep
categories?
tissue.
The one that sits on its own is called,
Mucosal
and it can only be called a mucosal pressure injury if it's
device.
Device related.
well done. Oh my
Related.
goodness, these K-Care girls are killing it. I hope all you online are killing it as well. Now, just while we're talking about the staging, just so you know, the Americans tried to create another category, an 8th category, and it hasn't been accepted, called a medical device related pressure injury. And the reason I got confused with that is we're already calling the mucosal pressure injuries has to be device related.
Absolutely.
And then we've got a separate medical device. And we know that a lot of, there are device related pressure and medical device related pressure injuries, but they usually cause a stage 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, so it doesn't sit as a category on its own. And there's another category that hasn't been accepted yet called atypical pressure injuries. These are classically someone that's got kyphosis and all the spine is all got this pressure injury all up it. It would still be a 3 or a 4 or a 2 or a 1, but it's an atypical pressure injury. And the other thing that I really wanted to make sure I spoke to you about, well, we've understood how to stage them. You cannot reverse stage them. You can't say, didn't I do a great job? It was a 4, it's now a 2, it went 4, 3, 2. This is amazing. Just because it's not as deep, just because we've got a bit of epidermal closure, what you need to remember is that will stay scarred for the rest of their life, and it doesn't take much to break down again. So it isn't 4, 3, 2, 1, bing, I had a win. If that person will have that scarring for the rest of their life. So you cannot reverse stage a pressure injury. So a couple of things that we've talked about today are the number 1 word for a pressure injury is
Localized.
Oh, localized. Sorry. Yes.
the cause of a pressure injury is
Shear and pressure.
Pressure.
yes. So remember, we talked about all these other things that look like pressure injuries, but they're not. And there was some examples around incontinence. You want to say?
Skin tears.
Diabetic leg ulcers, venous arterial leg ulcers. What else?
IAD, intrateginous dermatitis. That was the one with
yes.
the moisture. We didn't talk about the peri-wound and the peristomal. These are, like with all the enzymes that come out of the stoma, it's eating away at the skin. That is not a pressure injury, but they're all from different types of moisture. Intrateginous dermatitis, we talked about that as well. So, and the other one that gets confused a lot with the pressure injury is if we pretend this is someone's backside. So you've got the crack of their backside, and we hoist lift and it splits right on the coccyx. There is that linear lesion. Okay, that is not a pressure injury. It's usually when you get 2 skin folds together, we got urine and feces and moisture trapped, the skin overhydrates, it gets very weak, we hoist lift them and they tear. Very painful. It's called a linear lesion. Now, today we don't have time to go into other really exciting things, like there's a whole new research going on skin failure. I'm just going to mention it because I want you to leave with like I want more, I want more, I want more. And there's a whole new understanding of our body is full of organs, and we talk about heart failure, we talk about brain failure, we talk about lung failure, we talk about kidney failure, but we don't talk about skin failure. And there's a whole lot of research now on understanding acute, chronic, and end-stage skin failure, and it can get confused as a pressure injury. And there's a few other things that we haven't had time to talk about, but in summary, what I want to say to you is pressure injuries are tragic. They're unnecessary. They're incredibly painful. They're incredibly expensive. So don't neglect on buying the right equipment and setting people up the right way and being able to stage the right way so you can treat it the right way. But the last message I've got for you is they're mostly preventable. And that's why K-Care provided this for you today. And I look forward to stage 3 of this, because, well, seminar 3, whatever these girls are calling it, but super fun to be with you today. I hope you had a really good time, and thank you for joining in to learn about pressure injuries. See you later.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That was, my mind is blown. Every time I listen to you, I learn something new every single time. There is so much information in that brain of yours. It's brilliant. I'm loving it. Please remember to follow K-Care YouTube to gain access to K-Care Chat and be notified of any upcoming episodes. And look, if you have any questions for Tracy, please email any of your questions to info@carolexmedical.com.au. Now, episode 3 in our Pressure Point series is going to be based around what do we do once we've staged that pressure injury. Once we've got it in the right category and we know what the cause is, what are we going to do about it? So Tracy's going to take us down that road as well next time round. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Tracy. It was awesome. Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely excellent. Thank you very much. Bye.
We'll see you next time. See you, Tracy.
Bye.